We are hosting today an exciting interview with Dr. Paul Tyson on a series of recent books that he's written on Christian theology of science and gender theory. I'm joined today by Reverend Dr. Matt Boulter. I'll be starting off with questions on Paul Tyson's recent book as of 2022, Christian Theology of Science. This is the first of a series of interviews hosted by the Methexis Institute for the Advanced Study of Theology and Philosophy, which is located here in Austin, Texas, but hopes to channel as a kind of highway from the sky the greatest and current ideas in theology and philosophy from around the world.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you, Ryan and Matthew. I think the Methexis Institute is an extremely promising idea, and I hope you managed to get it really firmly launched and do some very good work. I'm assuming this is sort of continuous with William Desmond's sort of outlook of the in-between, where the transcendent is above us and the immanent is below us, and they all both fade into mystery, but between we have this sort of amazing space of revelation. And this is where I like to situate my work, so I'm very pleased to be talking with you.
The major innovation that I found in Christian theology of science is that you want to reject the false copula of theology and science. That is, the assumption that there are two siloed approaches to the way by which we generate knowledge and investigate the world that have to be joined together by the copula and instead frame it as a Christian interrogation or theological interpretation of the fundamental assumptions of natural science as they have shaped the modern world. In doing so, you critique a long-standing prejudice that we've held, which you describe in various ways as a kind of reductive materialism or atomism, that has assumed that all we can know about the world is what we can observe and the fundamental particles from which we build it up. And instead, you attempt to show that what we observe is in fact a sign of something higher that we participate in, and that all of our interpretive frameworks as well as our experimental models are shaped within. This is very similar to an approach that I have pioneered in my approach to logic and computers, which I've variously called theology of logic and theology of computers. And in many ways, part of the same genre of a kind of Augustinian theological investigation to natural sciences, which are assumed to be part of the repertoire of any learned person today, but also of what we can know of as it points back to our creator or to the source of meaning in the world. So could you tell us a bit more about how it is we've got here and what it is that makes it possible to open up this kind of discussion today? That is, how is it that we've sort of drifted down this long path of modernity that has led us to this false assumption that we have to situate theology at some kind of remove or otherwise copulated in a false binary with science? Or on the other hand, what is it can we now say as theologians from the ruptures of science about theology again?
Wonderful. So I'm very fortunate. I live in Brisbane and in Australia, and at the University of Queensland, where I was until quite recently, we had, until quite recently, a very famous historian of modern science and modern religion, being Peter Harrison. So Peter's done fabulous work in just historically describing the way in which science, as we know it, is only really invented in the 19th century. And prior to that, it was always natural philosophy, and natural philosophy was always embedded in categories of metaphysics and theology. And so you get this astonishing coup in the 19th century, which Peter calls the remarkable reversal, where instead of metaphysics and theology being the foundation of natural philosophy becomes the foundation of metaphysics and theology. And it's a profound shift. And what I've loved about particularly Catholic theologians is they never really swallowed it. Right? Protestant theologians basically drove this shift, but Catholic theologians who knew their stuff never swallowed it. And so you get this remarkable sort of stand out against this trajectory within certain areas of Catholic thinking. And I'm thinking in particular of the ressourcement movement and the communio movement in more recent times, where they say, hang on a minute, look, we're embedded in a meaningful cosmos, and you can't separate facts from meanings in these neat little ways, and you can't meaningfully understand the world as intelligible if you're just going on your own head. So this metaphysical theology has never really accepted the game. And as a result, it hasn't been engaged with science and religion for the past 100 years. So that the big bad period of science and religion is, I would say, about 1870 to 1970. And this is the period in which the whole Western high culture is secularized by this sort of aggressive push by people like Thomas Huxley, Herbert Spencer, Bertrand Russell, to sort of create a scientific foundation to all Western knowledge and meaning. It didn't work, and by the 1970s, the fact that it didn't work gives rise to postmodernism, but it did work in de-bedding Western culture from Christian metaphysical and theological presuppositions. And so I think any Christian theologian worth his salt hasn't played the game of trying to adapt science to religion and religion to science, which was the main game going on as largely initiated by Germanic liberal Protestant theologians way back in the, well, really in the end of the 18th century. The theologians who didn't play that game don't have really a name in the game. And they finally sort of came into the game with a project called After Science and Religion. And this was a Templeton-funded project, God bless the Templeton Foundation. We had 18 philosophical theologians from this tradition, which really hasn't been engaged in science and religion. We had a couple of scientists, and we had a couple of historians, and we tried to think about how do you understand natural philosophy if you assume that science and religion are not real things, they're not natural kinds, they're cultural constructs, they're moving around, and the idea of adapting, siloing them out and adapting one to the other is just a bad idea. How do we wipe all that out and start again and think after science and religion about natural philosophy and theology?
You had suggested that there was a kind of theological turn that occurred at the beginning of early modern science that led eventually in the Victorian era to a bullish repudiation of our theological inheritance in favor of a kind of reductive approach to science that was meant to ground all of knowledge. That this somehow culminated with figures like Thomas Huxley and Bertrand Russell's Logicist program and many other movements, perhaps like the Bloomsbury movement or forms of logical positivism that followed from that, and that many of those movements had been repudiated by the anti-foundationalist skepticism of postmodernism. But what I was peculiarly interested in is how it was that you had mentioned that Catholic theologians in particular had always been more resistant to this line of reductive interpretation. And I wanted to ask if perhaps the ressourcement movement that began, as you had mentioned, with the Henri de Lubac and his interpretation of the Church Fathers, particularly Origin of Alexandria, had been in many ways inspired by a very Catholic sense of tradition, of the passing on of tradition, but also of a symbolic worldview in which the bare elements of the world are always pointing above themselves to some higher source of meaning in which they all achieve some grander coherence, perhaps a sacramental vision of reality. And is that perhaps what we're drawing from today and why it is that we're seeing a renewal of Christianity in response to this movement?
Very much so. I think so. And I think it's because they're right. I mean, we don't live in a flat, empty world. We do live in a symbolically rich and intrinsically meaningful cosmos. And it is intelligible. Mind, Thomas Nagel's beautiful little book, Mind and Cosmos, it just doesn't make sense that the world is intelligible and that we can understand it in the modern reductive vision. So obviously there's been a mistake there. And the great Catholic tradition of profoundly intelligent metaphysical theology is just light years ahead of this whole modern deviation. And the modern deviation is killing itself at a remarkable rate. And it won't be long and the only thing left standing will be the Catholics. God bless them.
Yes, I think it's more relevant today than perhaps in many cases before. It's notable, but I would like to just, if I may, push back in sort of defense of modern science, because I think many of our viewers, including myself and Dr. Boulter, will agree that there has been something gravely lost in this bullish advance of a scientific reductionist worldview. But was there not something also quite glorious and productive about the development of these new forms of thought, whether it be in mechanical physics or in a kind of analytical vision of logic that was calculative and algebraic? I feel like maybe it's easy to sort of point back to the pre-modern, to the Neoplatonic inheritance of a metaphysical worldview, or to a sort of Christian story that encompasses it, but at the same time forget what has been gained from all these very moves. And I don't think that you're quite dismissing that, obviously. I think that the attempt to sort of interrogate theology, the scientific background of theology and vice versa, is also an attempt to bring it back within the fold of theological investigation.
There's no going back. There's no return to a pre-modern world. So what people like John Milbank are talking about is a new kind of modernity, and I think this is spot on. So the developments in natural philosophy have been extremely interesting and in many regards very fruitful over the modern period. But as another one of Peter Harrison's wonderful book, The Fall of Man and the Rise of Modern Science, points out, the skepticism that's grounded in a Christian understanding of the noetic effects of the fall, the empiricism that's grounded in that view, which is the alternative to Hume's view that was going on amongst the Presbyterian Scots in his day, is very fruitful if you assume that we can't know everything perfectly, but we can test things carefully, and through cautious engagement with the observed world, we can formulate rational and mathematically mappable patterns, which gives us a greater knowledge of how things work. This is a magnificent insight. And so there is much to be benefited from modern science. And even though philosophically modern science is predominantly anti-realist and basically is pragmatic and says, well, it's true because it works, that's not really true. Just because something works doesn't mean the way you understand it is true. However, it does work, and so there is a connection to truth. And this is, I think, there's much to be gained from modern science, and I'm not saying throw it out. What I am saying is that the natural philosophy of our era presupposes a naive scientism which justifies skepticism towards essential meaning and transcendent frames of reference. And that's just destructive, and it's going to be destructive of science itself, because Western science grows out of Christian theological and metaphysical warrants, and if you throw those warrants away, you'll lose the science after not too long. And this is exactly what's happening at the moment. So cutting off the metaphysical and theological warrants of modern science is going to kill modern science. How we reframe the natural knowledge that we've genuinely discovered in the modern period into a context where there's intrinsic meaning and moral reality and transcendent horizons is, I think, the big challenge people like Ryan and myself are trying to do. I'm trying to do a Christian theology of science. He's trying to do a theology of logic. We're not doing science and logic. We're not doing theology and logic. We're looking to integrate the categories of wisdom with the categories of knowledge. The separation of scientia from sapientia is the huge crisis of the modern era, and it's going to blow us up.
Joseph Ratzinger, on whom I did my PhD dissertation, would certainly agree with your critique of the separation of scientia from sapientia. He's complaining that in the modern world, we are not scientific enough.
Yeah, look, I believe in the reality is an integration of what we now call facts and what we now call values. And the idea that you could ever really separate them is just rubbish.
The reason I'm asking is because certain thinkers would argue that in the modern Western world, our confidence in science is too great, right? There are some people who would argue that, who would say that our hubristic confidence in modern science should be limited, right?
Well, one of the things I tried to argue in this book, which got me into a lot of trouble, was I was saying that science as what I call a first truth discourse fails. You have to have a meaningful first truth discourse as a culture in which natural philosophy is situated for natural philosophy itself to be truth-carrying. So the warrants of scientific truth are not in science itself. If a culture loses a meaningful first truth discourse which is transcendently linked, all immanence starts to become a human construct, and then it's just politics. This is the classical Foucauldian and Judith Butler line. Everything is biogovernance. And science is just a tool of power. And everything's a tool of power. Gender theory is a tool of power. It's all power. Power all the way down. There's no distinction between power and truth in the postmodern outlook. So anything that claims to be truth is in fact a power discourse. So science will get eaten by that. And I was just talking to Matthew about how in the end, postmodernism reduces all knowledge claims to power claims. And so science itself is simply a power discourse. And so you can do whatever you like with statistics and facts, just provide you push your own barrow.
One could argue that there was a kind of epistemic impasse in Gaston Bachelard's sense that occurred in medieval theology when the church began to censor the works of logicians and indeed later of physicists or astronomers like Galileo for reasons that were not evident or necessary for their disciplines. That is, they undermined the relative autonomy of the different sciences with a kind of overarching story that situated it within a theological framework from which otherwise it might contest and revolt. We can see this very clearly in figures like John Buridan, who wanted to separate the Master of Arts discipline from theology, or indeed like the Galileo affair, where we have new astronomical discoveries that don't fit within a Ptolemaic framework. But other cases can be pointed to where, for instance, the invention of modern algebra, algebraic logic, allowed for a new domain of calculations of calculated infinite movements, for instance, in the case of Georg Cantor, or Galileo even, that weren't possible within a finitistic Aristotelian framework. So can we not say that there were immense productive labors that were undertaken throughout this epoch of our civilization, and that in some cases they met with theological resistance, and cases where theology sort of failed its task, perhaps where a more sort of insightful theology could have given ballast to this movement, and in many cases has.
So if you look at the condemnations of the 13th century, the difficulties of integrating a sophisticated classical system of natural philosophy with dogmatic Christian theology and categories of philosophical theology were very difficult. I mean, the church sets up the medieval university, and the great intellectual heritage of the West starts really in modern times from the 12th century, 13th century universities. But the way in which the categories of integrity with the tradition of revelation, with the sort of freedom of intellectual exploration, always create tensions. And I think overarchingly, the Catholic Church did a reasonably good job of riding those tensions. And the Vatican has always taken a lot of interest in natural philosophy and has always had some of the brightest minds around taking an interest, and has always had some first-rate theologians. So the attempts of authority...
And first-rate astronomers.
Yes.
I mean,
and
the Vatican has had a resident astronomer for centuries.
They're very good, very impressive. Aquinas loves Aristotle, but he has no difficulty in explaining why Aristotle must have been wrong in things like the eternity of the world by appealing to revelation. And it's not like the eternal position doesn't make logical sense. It makes excellent logical sense. Aristotle is no fool, but it's not decisive, and we have revelation, and that gives us a decisive advantage. These delicately nuanced approaches are all the way through in Catholic philosophical theology, and they're a lot better than the sort of late 19th century science versus religion narrative tries to paint them. And there's no historian today working in science and religion who gives any credence to what's called the conflict thesis that was developed in the 19th century, which is basically an anti-Catholic Protestant propaganda piece, but still enormously popular and assumed in our secular universities. So I just don't accept the standard prejudicial view that medieval natural philosophy and the role of the church was oppressive. There was a very strong anti-Christian push through natural philosophy, and the idea was to flip the view of the laws of nature being direct work of God and just say the laws of nature are just nature. And this produces an anti-supernatural naturalism, which deeply infects our Western intellectual culture, and this is what produces the collapse of confidence in scientific truth, because science does not provide its own warrants.
I was impressed very much in your book as to how you showed that this was not simply a high-level theoretical development. It wasn't, for instance, that someone discovered that we could develop a concrete theory of the physical world that does not in any way depend upon theology or that is sufficient unto itself to explain the world. This was always a kind of perhaps aspiration, but wasn't something that was ever or could ever be demonstrably proven. But moreover, you suggested that it was more a matter of effective marketing of the authority of the physical sciences to a gullible 19th century audience, perhaps, that was disillusioned with their Christian faith, and that is one that had solidified in the 20th century under sort of regimes of authority, and ultimately in a way that sort of shows that if you believe that truth is power, that you use power to institute truth in such a way that the regime institutes its own authority of itself as a power discourse of natural science that excludes theology. But under these conditions, it would appear that appeals to theology or a theology of science would be, as it were, appeal to something that stood outside of the boundaries of legitimate knowledge, that wouldn't be authorized by the way by which we conceive of knowledge today when we use the word scientia to name all that we can be observed experimentally and test through the regimes of modern scientific research journals. So with all that being said, what has changed since the 1970s? You said previously that this was a way of thinking about the world that somehow had been eclipsed from the 1970s onward. You mentioned the postmodernists, the questions about how, for instance, a sociology of science had shown the limits of what can be known within this research field. But also we might point to, for instance, the radical questioning of the foundations of logic or of any physical science as founded upon logic and mathematics. And if so, how has that affected our culture? And what do you see as the new horizon for this? And perhaps where does your book fit into that cultural moment?
One of the things that I found a lot of pushback on my book is that people don't really appreciate the sociology of knowledge implications of what happened culturally. I'm not actually talking about what scientists do. I'm talking about what science as a cultural phenomena is. You'd have to be sleeping under a rock not to notice that even though the conflict thesis is rubbish, there was a concerted war in the name of science against religion for 100 years, and they won. Right? They really won. By 1970, the whole intellectual high culture had gone post-Christian and functionally materialist. I would say we are now half a century in the post-Christian West. And what we are now seeing is the disintegration of 1,000 years of cultural assumptions and enormous confusion if they were Western assumptions. And there's this sort of assumption that anything that's embedded in the Christian West is oppressive and backward, and in order to be progressive and in order to be enlightened and in order to be moving with the times, the church and everyone must get on the new bandwagon and become culturally post-Christian.
I wanted to shift over to talk more about some of the current social issues that this crisis of knowledge has given rise to. And in the past, we might have all believed that we had a kind of common sense notion of who the human person was and how we relate to one another as male and female. And this had, in many ways, been rooted in our shared mythology, certain norms that we had reproduced from generation to the next, involving dating and marriage and reciprocity between the sexes, that a person's embodiment gave a kind of outlook of possibility to how they could live within the world in a fruitful way. And many of these assumptions have been called into question, in part because of the attempt to find an atomistic basis that could be empirically tested and directly known through experimentation and deduction of what we were as humans, and in many cases finding that there was a greater variety than we had otherwise anticipated. So we find ourselves in a moment of crisis whereby we haven't a metaphysical or theological authority to appeal to in order to consolidate these common sense notions. While at the same time, there is an emancipatory movement that calls for new ways of exploring these identities in order to find ways of affirming types and outlooks that were otherwise hidden. Is it possible to find a basis in a previous metaphysical tradition, whether it be Christian or Neoplatonic, that can consolidate a notion of gender that has otherwise been lost?
The core argument of my book is that we've had 250 years of Enlightenment thinking that culminates in the postmodern moment. My argument is that Kant's Enlightenment is a purity movement. It's about purifying science from faith, and it's about purifying reason from metaphysics. And in order to do this, Kant embraces a phenomenological perspective where he says, well, look, we can't know reality, but we can know, all we can know is our experience of reality. So he radically locates reason and knowledge subjectively. And then this is the end of any sort of classical realism. And the fact is, Kant tries to get rid of mystery. He doesn't want mystery. He wants pure, clean, enlightened knowledge without any belief and without any fuzziness. And to do that, he just gets rid of reality. And if you know anything about the ancient sophists, this is a classic sophist move. The world is not knowable, but all knowledge is a poetic construction of human experience and language. It's a classic sophistry, and Kant reintroduces it into the West, but it takes until the 1970s for it to really catch on, because the culture isn't sophistic. The culture is still realist. So my basic argument is that it's the Enlightenment that causes a gender theory. Judith explains that sex and gender are co-constructions, and they are performative linguistic constructions, and they are essentially about governance and power. They are not about facts, and they are not about anything objectively meaningful. There is no such thing as objectively meaningful nature. Nature is our mind game. It's our word game. Science is our mind game and our word game. And all mind games and word games are about control and normative control in a culture and about power. So my argument is, if Kant is right, Judith Butler is right. If the Enlightenment was right, Butler's right. I think Kant's wrong, and therefore Butler is wrong. These moves are Christian to start with, but they are radically undermined the basis of Christian realism, and they end up blowing up the whole show. So that our culture now has got no defenses against sophistry.
I'm thinking about the fact that the last chapter in his book, Dominion, is called Woke. And what he argues in that final chapter in his book, Dominion, is that the woke movement has its roots in Christian theology.
The idea of justice for the oppressed is
right.
a fundamentally
In other words,
Christian
it's heresy.
category. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's taking aspects of the truth and then distorting it against other aspects of the truth.
So I think that what Tom Holland would be willing to say is that wokeism is Christian in the sense that it's a heresy, that it's
Yes.
a half-truth.
Like
like
modernity. It's a Christian heresy.
Like modernity itself. And so for me, that has massive implications about how we talk about it and how we sort of argue against it. I think that there's lots of, conservatives running around who want to defend people like John Locke, people like Immanuel Kant. And one of the reasons I appreciate genealogical thinkers like yourself is that they cause us to go back to the foundations of modernity and criticize that at the root. So one of many, many things that we could talk about in terms of radical orthodoxy and John Milbank and others, Rowan Williams, is that they like to talk about alternative modernities, right? And so there's several characters that someone like John Milbank, other people as well, like David Bentley Hart, all of whom are very closely aligned with your thought. They provide us with some tools, some resources, some ingredients to maybe construct an alternative modernity, an alternative enlightenment. So here's my question for you. When I was reading your book, I think that I heard you saying that there's some sense in which you wanted to redeem the Enlightenment. So I didn't hear you arguing for an alternative enlightenment. It was almost as if you were trying to say Kant. I think that maybe you wanted to say that his original essay, What is Enlightenment? Maybe you were giving him a high five, but then in the first critique, he went off the rails. In what sense, if any, are you wanting to redeem the Enlightenment?
I think his essay, What is Enlightenment, is the most effective propaganda piece of the last 250 years, and it's terrible. So there's no high five from me there. I think reason and science are absolutely wonderful things, right? And I think after the Enlightenment, they self-destruct. The Enlightenment is what makes them self-destruct. So if we want reason and science, you have to return to a reason that's grounded in cosmic logos, and you have to return to science which is underpinned by theological warrants. And if you're not prepared to do those things, just throw reason and science out and just have power. The sophist is a master of word games. That has always been the case. So a sophist understands the fragility of language. And the sophist knows the slippage and the tricks in how to communicate and how to miscommunicate more precisely. And when you get someone like Derrida, they can make anything a form of miscommunication. Anything, right? And everything is miscommunication, even apparently the communication that language is miscommunication. So
I think many of our viewers will be surprised to hear that the problem with modern gender theory can be traced to Immanuel Kant. But it sounds now that you've made an even bolder genealogical claim to say that, in fact, it results from a rejection of a Neoplatonic worldview sometime in the late Middle Ages. I think the difficulty that many people will have approaching this, and perhaps figures like Kathleen Stock, who endorsed your book, is how is it that we can defend these common sense notions on the basis of what seemed like mystifying assumptions about the participation of signification in higher forms or archetypes? How is it that, as it were, we can get back to what Matt described as the morning knowledge of the angels within our world of finite calculation? And is this not the culture shift that we're encountering? On the one hand, people, since the Bloomsbury group, have tried to ground all of our aspirations for how we wish to live within the world within a kind of atomistic logical framework. On the other hand, people today, like for instance Louise Perry, are advocating for something like a participatory worldview that we can come back to, even in the notion of gender.
the most significant book that I've read in the past 30 years is John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory, because John gave me the missing piece on why modernity makes no sense. And it's the 14th century nominalist and voluntarist revolution. Modernity is born corrupt. And like you say, it's not Kant. It starts much earlier than that. The powerful interest with people like Shivara in Aquinas's analogical metaphysics. This is the positive Western tradition. This is the Western tradition integrated with the apophatic, with Pseudo-Dionysius, with Nicholas of Cusa, with the Church Fathers, that could give us the alternative enlightenment, the alternative modernity that we radically need.
Do you accept and affirm that there's a distinction between biological sex on the one hand and gender on the other? The reason I ask is because it seems to me that once you grant this distinction, you're already on the terrain of gender theory.
I do accept that, but I think it puts me on the opposite side of the ledger than you think. If you look at second and fourth wave feminists, radical feminists, they uphold the distinction between sex and gender. Okay? So they say that they are sex realists. There is biological sex whatever you identify as with, and that gender is a social construct. So gender is about roles that relate to sex that are socially acceptable or are personally determined, and you can be a gender nonconformist male and a gender nonconformist female, but you are still a male and a female. That's the classical sex realist feminist position.
Good.
I think it's correct, right? Now,
Excellent.
It's third wave feminism that denies the distinction. Judith Butler denies that distinction, right? She always uses sex and gender in quotation marks and says they're co-constructed, radically poetic and performative, and they can be whatever each individual decides. So there is no distinction between sex and gender to gender theory. There is a distinction to radical feminists, and there is a distinction to Christian sex realists. Judith Butler's gender trouble, this is what started the whole thing. She is determined to throw out biological sex as an objective reality. And she is determined to say that everything is gender, that sex is gender. Sex is defined by gender. Whatever you feel your gender is, that defines your sex. Neither what you feel your sex is, nor what people so-called objectively assume it is by evidence, is what it is. It's only a construction of personal linguistic and cultural power dynamics. And so there is no distinction between sex and gender to gender theory as progressed within third wave feminism. And if you go to university and you study gender theory, that's what you'll get.
All Christian Platonists would acknowledge the reality of essences, and hence of natural kinds. However, do you think that folks who worry about essentialism have a point? What is your understanding of that term essentialism, and how would you steelman the critique of alleged essentialism?
So modern essentialism fails because, assuming a secularized natura pura worldview, it is intrinsically anti-metaphysical and anti-theological. So modern essentialism doesn't work. People tried to make it work. It was a big project in the 20th century. It totally failed. But because modern methodologically atheist, anti-metaphysical, and anti-supernaturalism attempts at positivist essentialism fail does not mean that postmodern anti-essentialism succeeds. Postmodern
Right.
anti-essentialism is premised on the failure of modern essentialism. Now, if the
Right.
reason why modern essentialism failed is because it was barking up the wrong tree in the first place, assuming that the failure of modern essentialism is the failure of essentialism per se is false. And this is what postmodernism does.
Agreed.
So
Right.
I
Agreed. I love it.
I understand.
Postmodernists are
They're modernists. They're hypermodernists rather than postmodernists.
yeah.
I understand essence in hylomorphic terms, presupposing an intelligible universe where Christ is the logos of creation, read John Betts, upholding objective reality, and is also Christ the teacher, read Augustine, within my subjective consciousness, thus external meaning and internal understanding are linked. This is exactly what modernism and postmodernism can't do. And that's why they don't understand essentialism. My argument is that the purity agenda of the Enlightenment naturally eats itself. And this is what postmodernism is. The fact that postmodernism rejects all essence and rejects all meta-narrative is premised on the failure of the Enlightenment project. I accept that the Enlightenment project fails, but I do not accept that its failure means that essence doesn't exist.
So the postmodernists are essentially reacting against a straw man.
Well, they're taking modernity as the decisive embodiment of essential, rational truth, right? And so the fact that that doesn't work gives them license to create whatever meaning they like. So they're not interested in essence because they think it's dead, because they falsely assume that modernity was actually genuinely essentialist. It never was.
Yes. And I think that in the same way, Kant is reacting against something of a straw man in terms of the pre-modern understanding of realism. I mean, like, I think that let's talk about Kant's Copernican revolution, right? Which is another one of these very popular theories that gets handed down to us in the air that we breathe. It's kind of like the story about Copernicus. And I just worry that even in your book, you're making it seem like Kant was reacting against some kind of naive realism and flipping the script and wanting to enact a reversal, whereas in reality, that which existed before Kant wasn't simply realist in the modern sense or in a naive sense. I agree that we should avoid anti-realism, but we should also avoid anti-idealism. And I just think that the pre-modern picture isn't simply realist in a naive way. And I worry that your book leaves readers walking away thinking that in pre-modernity, people were just naive realists.
Look at the 18th century. Kant is not reacting against traditional realism. He's in a sphere of rationalist deism. He's in the sphere of Humean empiricism. So he is very much a child of the rationalist deist empiricist 18th century, and he's got no interest in Augustine, no interest in Aquinas, no interest in Plato, no interest in Aristotle, no interest at all. He's not reacting against realism. He's just going with the cultural flow, the trends of the time. It's fashionable. And Kant's riding this fashion. And, in the name of the limits of knowledge, we're only going to go this far. We exclude God and reality. That's not humble. That's putting the human self at the center of everything, right? So I think it's just theologically toxic. It's got nothing to do with realism. He's already a post-realist before he starts. And if you want to understand realism, you've got to read Plato, you've got to read Augustine, you've got to read Aquinas.
I wondered if you could say a few words in conclusion, Paul, about what you see as the trajectory of your work now. It's also how your work has touched upon this current fissure in our time and what you imagine the future might bring?
We've seen, I think it's fair to say that culture abhors a vacuum, and that if you take a metaphysical foundation out of culture, something else is going to fill it. And we're looking around for something else that's post-Christian to fill the vacuum. And once we do that, the West will no longer be recognizably West. It'll be something new. Possibly Islam could fill the vacuum. I can't see postmodernism filling the vacuum because it's so intrinsically void. But something will fill the vacuum. It's time to stop fitting in with the post-Christian world and just being nice people. We have got something radically alternative to the spirit of our times, which is the only thing that will save it. So I think we might probably be at a bit of a post-Constantinian St. Anthony in the desert moment. So I'm hoping that things will come up from monasteries in the desert, and as Western civilization collapses, there'll be seeds for a new civilization in 500 or 600 years' time.
On that note, thank you very much for your generosity and contributing this brilliant interview with us.
Well, thanks very much, Ryan and Matthew. It's been a pleasure talking with you both.
Thank you.